and we want to talk about the sort of McCarthyite type attitude that seems to be descending in tandem with the new Cold War. So, what is old is new again. But to discuss this issue, we are very happy to be joined once again by Dr. Ben Becker, who is the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. Dr. Ben Becker, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. Really glad you agreed. Sort of very rare that, we can get Breakthrough News on Breakthrough News.
Always turning
but either
down.
way,
Always turning us
it's, it feels a little through the looking glass here, especially for those of us who look through history. But I mean, we've got a bipartisan House Select Committee on China and, claiming to be investigating this, that, and the third. You've got Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio in the Senate. You've got Comer in the House, who are every day, it seems, releasing some new letter saying, go after this person or that person. The Daily Beast, the New York Times writing articles. You have the DOJ going after any scientist who ever looked at China on a map somewhere. I mean, it really does feel like we are in a tightening vice in this country in terms of what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say that is related to geopolitics. Should we be concerned?
Yes. I mean, I think it's a very serious matter. Just yesterday, it took another turn when Senator Marco Rubio issued a letter to the Department of Justice calling on the DOJ to initiate investigations into a variety of independent media, peace organizations, progressive organizations, anti-racist groups. This comes 5 days after a similar letter that was targeting quite mainstream major environmental groups, also saying that these too are fronts of China, that these are unregistered foreign agents of China inside the United States. So there is a larger witch hunt that's beginning or that's already begun. It has every indication that it's going to accelerate and draw more and more people into its net, as all witch hunts do historically. And it's a major threat to free speech, because ultimately what is at the heart of this is that political speech, dissidents, people who are opposed to the turn of U.S. foreign policy and military establishment towards confrontation and conflict with China, people who basically say this is a terrible idea and that we should go a different route, are being accused of essentially a thought crime. And therefore, in the elite bubble, to have that view means you must be under the employ of a foreign power, because this is, quote unquote, echoing Chinese talking points or amplifying Chinese talking points. Even if you independently, in other words, come to certain conclusions because of your own political viewpoints, your own experience, that's what's happening right now. And it's a major danger for the left, but I think also for anyone who cares about peace, anyone who cares about free speech, anyone who cares about civil liberties. And so the first McCarthyism was a huge blow to free speech in the 1950s. It took 10 years really for that cloud to be lifted. In some ways, it never was lifted. And now that cloud is coming back, and it's an urgent matter that all progressive people, all independent media really unite at this moment to fight back. And I think if we take a step back from it, as you said, it really is at the heart. It's about the new Cold War, that 5 or 6 years ago, it was fine to be friends with China. It was fine to say we should have a reset with Russia. Remember, this was the official policy of the Bush administration, the Obama administration. Now to say the things that were commonplace 5 or 6 years ago makes you a foreign agent today. And so basically the New York Times and other elite media are playing the same role it's always played, which is they wait for their cues from the State Department, from the Pentagon, from Washington to say, even though we were friends with these people a few years ago, these are the new enemies. Now just do your work, go all out to demonize them, to make it basically unacceptable in respectable society, to not go along with it. And that's how we create the ideological consensus for when the war finally does come. And this is preparations for that kind of conflict, and it's just happening in advance. And as usual, the left is often the first one to suffer the blows, because the left is the most sort of consistent anti-war peace voice in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite outrageous the way you've had these mainstream outlets, with the New York Times most recently attacking actual peace groups, just literally attacking groups that are calling for no Cold War with China, saying no war. That's literally it. No war becomes a Chinese government talking point. And, oh, they must be influenced by the Chinese government, and essentially advocating that these groups be investigated for advocating against war. But can you talk about the specifics here, Ben? Because I think when a lot of people think of FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, they think of state-funded media, because that's when it was first became popularized in recent years, right? Against, RT, against Press TV, against I believe CGTN as well was forced to register at some point after, the Trump administration came to office and the whole aftermath of like Russiagate hysteria. But we're not talking, we can talk, that's a different conversation to have about what should be forced to register as a foreign agent. The Israel lobbying groups that are actively connected to the Israeli government, of course, never are. But what is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and why is it so dangerous that you have someone like Marco Rubio, like basically invoking that and saying that we should have the DOJ investigate peace groups and media outlets that are, independent of any foreign government?
Right. The FARA law comes really out of the 1930s at the height of Nazism. And it was initially conceived of as a law to basically keep the Nazis from influencing U.S. public opinion. This was at a time, by the way, when, supporters of Nazism could fill up Madison Square Garden. There was quite a significant sort of far-right movement inside the United States. And so that's how the law went through. But we're in a very different moment from 1938, I'd say. The law is written with a lot of vagueness and a lot of sort of broad interpretive powers for law enforcement so that they can do exactly what you're saying, which is to politically and selectively decide who they want to characterize as a foreign agent. And the crazy thing about this law is that it's not just actually about a foreign government. It's actually if you are representing or sort of under the direction of any foreign entity. And it doesn't even make clear what that is. In other words, you could be the foreign entity of a corporation, of an organization, of a NGO in another country. If you're employed by the subsidiary of another foreign entity, all these things, technically, they could try to say this makes you a foreign agent, which of course sounds like you're a spy or something, but because the word is very evocative. But it's written so that basically they can go after whoever they want to go after and say you're a foreign agent, but they don't really have a lot of technical guidance about what that actually means. I'm before the abolition of the law altogether. I think there's more than enough, legal stuff out there to protect against espionage. But this is really just a law that's sort of a plaything for whoever controls Congress at any given moment or controls the Department of Justice to then initiate investigations against their political enemies. To show you how broad this is, there's a case of a hotel worker in Boston. His name is Henry Liang, very well-known community activist in the Chinese community there. He's for peace with China. He's for reunification between the mainland and Taiwan. He does local activism. Everybody knows him. He's a hotel worker, as I said. And the fact that he has a friend and in the Chinese consulate in Boston that he communicates with, which is not a crime. Many U.S. policymakers, business leaders, people communicate with foreign governments all the time. But they've seized his phone, and the fact that his friend in the consulate would ask him a question like how many people came to this protest or little things like that. And the fact that he responds, now he's taking the direction of a foreign power. And he actually got arrested under FARA as being an unregistered foreign agent. Here he's a hotel worker who's not providing anything that's not already publicly known. This is public information. He's talking about things that are happening in his life, in his political activity. And yet that's being sort of painted in the mainstream media by the DOJ as this grand espionage case. And so that's just a good example of this kind of selectivity as we're talking about. It's not even selectivity because that makes it sound like he's doing something wrong, but it's really about its political weaponization. As you said, AIPAC is not registered as a foreign agent. There's all these mainstream think tanks that receive hundreds of thousands of dollars from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and these are U.S. allies. And then they write reports that then influence U.S. public opinion on those very countries, and yet they're never asked to register as foreign agents. So it really depends on who the enemy is at a given moment that's been declared in Washington, and then they drag out the law to basically target whoever they want domestically. They've
No,
also
it's
went
such a
after the
good
African
point.
People's Socialist Party the same way.
Yeah, no, I mean it's such a good point, and I'm glad you mentioned the African People's Socialist Party as well. Just another one of these many cases, and it's ironic. I mean, anyone who knows anything about this sort of DC social scene amongst the elites, a very coveted invitation is to be invited to a party at embassy, and these people fall all over themselves in Georgetown and Spring Valley or whatever to have all these foreign officials, coming to their parties and their cocktail hours, and they're never, arrested for FAR or whatever for dishing to the British embassy.
Nor should they be.
And they're doing real deals in those ones. But anyway, I just want to also put this in context of the importance of understanding what took place here in the first McCarthyism. Because we hear about it, people know about it, but the impact of it on U.S. policy towards Asia and how that ended up in the Vietnam War, around civil rights, around the labor movement. I mean, talk about that if you could, because I think the impact of McCarthyism was so pernicious, but a lot of that has been kind of lost, I think, over the years as the names and the figures and the entities have just sort of faded as time goes on.
Yeah, I think it's a good point because, in high school, if you learn about it at all, it's pretty much you don't get much past the Hollywood 10, which is, of course, an important story about, central cultural figures in the entertainment industry who were blacklisted, who lost their jobs, their careers, and, of course, weren't able to make the sort of contribution to popular culture that they were before, had their lives destroyed and ruined. But beyond the sort of fancy celebrities, and of course they were victims of it, the most prominent victims of it, there's this whole other story which involves really thousands or even tens of thousands of regular working people, peace activists, labor unionists, people who for one reason or another had been basically around the Communist Party or around mass organizations that were connected to the Communist Party, or people who just read the Communist Party newspaper or had been to an event where communists were speaking. Because, of course, in the period right before McCarthyism, the US and the Soviet Union were allied against Nazism. The prestige of the Soviet Union was quite high. There were actually large numbers of people who wanted peace with the Soviet Union, who opposed the Cold War, who said that there could be a sort of a permanent alliance that would safeguard peace for decades to come instead of having a new nuclear arms race, for instance. There's a lot of people who wanted those kinds of politics. And basically, in order to eradicate that stream in US society, there had to be a full court press, a full assault on every sector of society where there was a reserve of sympathy for the Soviet Union or for the anti-colonial struggles or for any progressive issue. And so that's why, the whole civil rights movement in its early years was basically cast as a communist plot that was trying to destroy the United States from within. So many other social movements were portrayed the same way. It made it very hard for the people to speak openly. It made it very hard to explore different political ideas, and it really inhibited organizing. And in the long term, it also really destroyed some of the more sane voices in the foreign policy establishment, because the whole concept that initiated that first McCarthyism was who lost China. Now, this question after the Chinese Revolution, it's worth digging into because in a way we're in a moment right now where it's like who lost China part 2. And through the 1940s, they thought that China was going to be in their camp. Then the Chinese Revolution happens, and it initiates this frenzy in Washington about who was responsible in Washington, who were the secret communist sympathizers. And according to this domino theory that they had at that moment, basically the top objective of all U.S. foreign policy had to be to prevent the spread of socialism and communism. And basically anybody who called for, normalized relations with these governments or for peace with these governments or hearing what their perspectives were, what was the actual perspective of the people of Vietnam and Korea and China about independence, those people were obviously targeted in the witch hunt. They had to have been under the employ of a foreign power. So that meant any sort of restraining voices on peace, for peace, were eliminated. And that's how you get this rush into the Vietnam War, where even though there were many people who could see where this was going to go, that this was going to become a quagmire, that this was going to cause millions of needless deaths, nobody could say it because your career also would be destroyed, or the people who would have said it were already removed from any sort of positions of influence. And so this sort of McCarthy period that we're in now which again is sort of mobilized by the same kind of anxiety that the US is losing its grip on the world or has already lost its grip, it's going to have really catastrophic consequences if it's allowed to continue. Because then when the issue comes, when there is that confrontation that's coming probably over Taiwan or over Korea, or over China itself, like over the mainland, who are the voices that are going to say, hey guys, this could be World War III, this could be catastrophe. If we do this, we have no chance of safeguarding peace. We have no chance of stopping climate change. We have so many other things we can't do if we go to war with China. Those voices aren't going to be there because they've already going to have lost their careers or they're going to be afraid. Mm-hmm. And actually, if you look at it, the New York Times is at the vanguard of this kind of McCarthyite wave. They're the ones setting the tone for what is acceptable politics right now.
Yeah. I want just real quick before we let you go, Ben, I do want you to talk a little bit more about the issue of the media's role here. Because like you just mentioned with the New York Times being at the vanguard of this, the mainstream media is playing a massive role in pushing this McCarthyism. And what you have here is a big, massive media outlet that we know is oftentimes a stenographer for the state's foreign policy, attacking smaller independent media as well as activists. Can you talk a little bit, just real quick, about the role the mainstream media plays in pushing this narrative?
Yeah, I think sometimes they're the stenographers for power, and sometimes I think they're the actual script writers. Because, when you look at like the Libya war, there were actually quite a few restraining voices inside even the military who said this Libya war is going to be a catastrophe. But you had this collaboration between some in the State Department who are heavily interventionist, Hillary Clinton in particular, but a few others, and then the media itself that was saying, if you don't go to war, you're going to be responsible for the next genocide, the next humanitarian catastrophe. Basically pressured Washington, pressured Obama into going to war so that he wouldn't have that sort of as part of his legacy. And so you've actually seen this switch, I think, in recent decades where sometimes the politicians, because they're such creatures of the media themselves, all they care about is the media. How is this going to play on social media for them? So they're actually taking their cues sometimes from the media. And you have the media, which is so deeply integrated with the intelligence services, with the State Department, with the permanent bureaucracy in Washington. Ultimately, we have to remember these are the same people, essentially. There's a revolving door between all of this. And in fact, they go to the same universities, the same Ivy League schools. They have the same pedigree. They're the children of the CEOs. They're married to hedge fund, bankers and the rest of them. They're all integrated. And so, they start getting their narrative going in their own little bubble, and they don't look at the rest of the world. They don't really care what the rest of the world wants. And so it sort of becomes self-fulfilling. And it's unclear sometimes whether the media is driving Washington, whether Washington is driving the media. But the main thing is to understand it as really one class. Never mind the fact that 83% of Nigerians, for instance, have a favorable opinion of China. Never mind that 60-some% of people in Kenya have a favorable opinion of China, want a positive relationship. No, if any news outlet in the United States like Breakthrough or anyone else says it's in China's and Africa's best interest to work together and to oppose this new Cold War, no, now we're echoing Chinese talking points. So, according to this logic, literally hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions of people are echoing Chinese talking points and should be arrested as foreign agents.
Yeah. There's a certain level of racism to it, that's for sure as well, in terms of knowledge production and who's assumed to be able to form their own thoughts and who's being controlled by some sneaky person, which has its own yellow peril racism to it. But nonetheless, that's another topic for another time. Dr. Ben Becker, editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, great outlet if you don't know about it. Thanks so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.